Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today at the PR Fest event, where Sasha Carey from Bellwether Green, a boutique law firm based in Glasgow, Scotland, joins us to talk to us today about our employers' responsibilities when working from home. We have had quite a lot of experience in the last 8 months, trial and error, figuring out like working from home status, looking at employee engagement and stakeholder engagement on the wider scale as well. But there are certain legal responsibilities you will have, and it would be really interesting to hear from Sasha what they are, and longer term, if we're thinking of like a hybrid model of working, what does that look like? What are we thinking as an industry? And also as well, what actions do we need to take that we possibly haven't even considered so far? So I'd like to welcome Sasha this morning. Welcome, Sasha.
Hello, thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us this morning. I'm just going to hand over to you just now, and then what we'll do is I'll come back to you with any questions at the end.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm going to be talking to you about your obligations as an employer during the coronavirus pandemic, particularly while staff are working from home. You will no doubt have had to implement new working arrangements and practices which have been sort of uncharted territory for a lot of employers. And I'll be discussing how to overcome the challenges that you're likely to face throughout this period. And we'll also cover the potential longer term changes to working arrangements once we actually return to office-based working. Obviously, we don't know when that will be entirely. So the rules can be a little confusing to keep track of, especially now that there are COVID protection levels with different restrictions, which vary across each local authority area in Scotland, whereas currently in England there's a second national lockdown, and then we're due to go into a tiered system as well. So there is also sort of varying guidance for each industry sector, and therefore this talk is intended to provide a general overview of the law. However, it's not possible to apply a one-size-fits-all approach, and therefore I would emphasise the need to keep an eye on the current government guidance and ACAS advice for employers, and ensure that you're following this. So as it stands, the current government coronavirus advice is that people can travel to work where it's essential and necessary, but businesses should make every reasonable effort to make working from home the default position if it's possible for you to sort of do so. So first of all, what are your legal obligations as an employer while staff are working from home? Obviously, you will have had to potentially have made quite an abrupt shift to home working. And while this isn't an entirely new concept, the law in this area is sort of not particularly employee friendly and has some catching up to do. So for this reason, there'll need to be a degree of flexibility and sensitivity to each other's situations between you and your employees. Due to the sort of uncertainty of the situation, communication really is key here. So from keeping your employees updated on any changes to working arrangements, to checking in on them regularly and discussing sort of any concerns or problems that they might be having. So firstly, a question you might ask would be, do I need to document any changes, i.e. the implementation of home working, to my employees' employment contracts? So in answer to that, you might want to double check your employees' existing contracts of employment. They may already contain a requirement to work from home where they're instructed to do so, or where there are business continuity reasons to ask them to do so, for example, a pandemic. And therefore, that would mean that no amendments would be necessary. However, if there's no such clause imposing a home working requirement, or where you're expanding that requirement, asking employees to do so would amount to a variation of their contract, and therefore it would be best to obtain their sort of agreement to varying the contract on that basis. Now, there'd be no need for you to sort of produce entirely new contracts of employment. This change could just be documented by way of a letter. Best to do it in writing, though. You might wish to specify whether this is intended to be permanent or temporary, and in the case of the latter, you might want to include sort of right to revert back to office-based working, so bringing home working to an end, and return to normal working practices in the future. You would need to just confirm to your employees that their pay, their working hours and other terms and conditions would remain the same, obviously, if that's your intention. And you might also want to consider implementing a home working policy, if you don't have one already, just to provide clarity for everybody on where you all stand. So secondly, with regard to sort of health and safety obligations, by law, you're responsible for the health, safety and welfare of your employees, and that includes those employees that are working from home. So if you've not already done so, you'll need to conduct a sort of risk assessment of their work activities, and you are responsible for sort of taking reasonable steps to prevent harm in the workplace now being from home. So if changes are needed to make sure that an employee can work from home safely, you would be responsible for making sure they happen. And also, it's not kind of just a one-off thing. You should review your risk assessments regularly. In the context of coronavirus and home working in particular, there are likely to be additional considerations and issues requiring additional measures to be put in place. Some examples might be, firstly, stress. So some staff may find it difficult to sort of enforce boundaries between work and life while they're working from home, sort of work and their home life, sorry. Others may become isolated. They might feel that they're lacking the usual support networks that they would have at the office. So if contact is poor, they might feel disconnected or abandoned, and this can obviously affect stress levels of employees and mental health. So you'd need to sort of consider steps to monitor work and stress levels and try to keep the team integrated. And again, I would advise keep in touch with staff regularly. And sort of discuss any concerns they might have, check on their health and their well-being, and let them know whether you have any support as a sort of business that's available, or whether there is any support available to them externally. So another consideration would be equipment. Obviously, when you're in the office, you've got your equipment at work, but if you need to supply equipment to your employees sort of while they're working from home, it must be suitable for purpose. It should be in good working order, and really it should be sort of inspected regularly just to make sure, you know, nothing's become dangerous. Consider things like, is the employee's workspace well lit? If they're using display screen equipment on a long-term basis, you might want to tell them to take regular sort of rest breaks, maybe sort of 5 minutes every hour or so, get up, move, stretch about. You'll also need to consider insurance. So if you provided equipment, is that covered by your insurance policy? And if not, you'd need to ask the employee to sort of take out insurance cover, and you may want to agree to cover any costs associated with that. Electricity as well, so you should remind employees that their domestic supply, for example, electric sockets and things like that, remain their responsibility. In terms of first aid, under the health and safety regulations, employers must supply appropriate first aid provisions to all employees, and this includes home workers as well. So most home working will be low risk, and therefore a first aid kit would usually suffice. Obviously depends on, you know, the nature of that employee's role. In terms of accidents, you'll need to sort of establish a proper procedure to allow home workers to report any serious accidents or injuries. In terms of risk assessments, if you're not able to carry out a full risk assessment because of the pandemic, you might want to ask your employees to carry out their own risk assessment of their workspace and equipment from home. And there's quite a useful workstation checklist available on the government website, so you could provide that to them if that's what you need them to do. There's also currently a service providing support with workplace risk assessments for small and medium businesses, which is run by health and safety experts, and you can contact them on the following email address: businesssupport@scottishchambers.org.uk. So that's quite a useful resource if you're sort of struggling with that or need some assistance. Thirdly, you need to sort of give some consideration to equality issues. So you would need to give consideration to the health circumstances and protected characteristics of your employees as part of the risk assessment process. So you should be looking at each individual home worker separately to ensure that you're complying with any duties that you may have towards them. There may be obviously varying needs and requirements. For example, pregnant employees or any employees with disabilities. You should also consider hidden disabilities that aren't sort of immediately obvious, such as anxiety and depression, which can often fall within the definition of disability for the purposes of the Equality Act. So you may also have staff with anxiety, which is actually heightened as a result of the ongoing pandemic. So you'll need to bear that in mind. The requirement to make reasonable adjustments for disabled employees still applies when they are working sort of remotely from home, which means that you must avoid essentially putting disabled workers at a disadvantage. So you should aim to replicate reasonable adjustments for them at home if possible. And again, I would say that communication really is key here. So if it would be useful for you to kind of speak to them directly to assess their needs rather than make assumptions. And you may have, for example, a member of staff that actually requires additional extra special equipment to enable them to work from home. And if you're still unsure, then you might want to consider obtaining an occupational health assessment of their home working space. You would also want to consider what can be done to mitigate the impact that home working will have on those employees with caring responsibilities. So you, for example, could be flexible with start and finish times. That might help people continue to work at home whilst also caring for somebody. In cases where you're unable to make reasonable adjustments, for example, the cost of doing so, you may wish to consider furlough leave for those employees until it's actually safe for them to return to work. So in terms of expenses that your employees may well incur as a result of working from home, you may have your own policy on expenses, but you should let staff know also that they can claim tax relief on any additional household expenses that they've incurred as a result of home working, whether that be for all or part of the week, for example, heating and lighting. So from the 6th of April 2020, this was based on £6 per week, and your employers will receive their entitlement just simply by way of an adjustment to their tax code. Now, the exact rules for that can be found on the government website. So if you just tell them to submit their own expenses claims by searching claim tax relief on your job expenses via the government website, that's how they would be able to do that themselves. So another question you might ask is, how do we actually manage home working employees? Because obviously it's quite different to, being in the office where you would see them face to face every day. So obviously keeping in touch with employees is important, and it can be useful to agree how and when you will communicate with each other. So if you haven't already, you might wish to introduce sort of new methods of communication, such as instant messaging, video calls, and you might also want to encourage staff to continue communicating with each other to avoid potential damage to sort of team working culture, maintain staff morale, and minimise feelings of isolation. Now, team meetings are a good opportunity to keep in contact and catch up whilst ensuring that everyone still feels included. One-to-one meetings will also enable you to speak with staff on a more personal level about how they're feeling and discuss any concerns that they might have that they don't want to bring up, in a group team meeting. So different management styles may be required compared to what you're used to using in the office. And it will basically be more difficult, I'm sure, for you to manage staff that you no longer see on a daily basis. So it's important for you to be clear about what's expected and agree how you will measure your employees' performance, whether any sort of remote learning or development will be provided. Okay, so just again, being clear really with regard to your expectations. Now, in terms of sort of issues at work, normal disciplinary and grievance procedures should continue to apply in the same way, regardless of whether staff are working from home, and this should be made clear to them. So you may wish to implement specific rules setting out your expectations, for example, prohibiting them from using working hours for home or family commitments so that work time is as productive as possible. And staff appraisals should sort of continue to take place, but where these are usually once or twice a year maximum, it might be sort of useful to agree a more frequent reporting and appraisal system to replace the lack of day-to-day feedback, guidance and encouragement that staff would usually receive on a daily basis at the office. So actually your staff, you may find that they are concerned that you might think they're working less effectively at home, and therefore it would be useful for you to just let them know what your expectations are in advance and how you intend on measuring their performance so they can be confident that they're getting everything right. Now, moving on to sort of potential challenges that you might face while staff are working from home and ways that you can sort of overcome those. So quite a big one would be potential data security breaches. So obviously all employees have an implied duty not to disclose or use confidential information about their employer's business. And this would apply equally to those working from home as those working within the office. But clearly this would be more difficult for you to sort of police and control whilst staff are home working. So you should therefore remind your staff of this duty, and you might wish to clearly define what information you consider to be confidential information within their contracts. Now, data protection is also important, meaning your employees must keep confidential information secure. So the ICO can impose quite significant hefty fines for serious breaches of GDPR, and therefore you should carry out an assessment of the data protection implications of staff working from home, and you'll need to satisfy yourself that the risk is low. Okay. If you don't already have an IT policy in place, now would be a good time to introduce one. You might want to consider sort of giving staff training on their obligations regarding data protection and confidentiality and the procedures that they must follow. You will need to consider precautions for keeping information secure, for example, forbidding access by household members, using passwords, encryptions, maybe depending on sort of the nature of your business, providing facilities such as secure filing or a shredder. You want to consider the use of internet and email, whether it can be used on a personal basis by your employees, what you consider to constitute inappropriate use of sort of those facilities. You'd also, I assume, want to provide some guidance on the use of social media, if you haven't done so already, and the continuing obligation to protect the reputation of the business whilst staff are working from home. Okay. Another issue that you might face is you may have staff that have sort of childcare problems. Obviously, the current circumstances are completely unusual. Schools and nurseries have closed, reopened. We don't know whether they may, close again. Children displaying potential symptoms of being sent home. So most staff with children are likely to encounter childcare issues at some stage, and putting a total ban on looking after children while working from home may prevent sort of quite a large proportion of your staff from being able to work at all. It can obviously be quite stressful for staff to juggle childcare responsibilities with work. So it's important to be understanding and sensitive to their individual situations. Again, regular communication will help ensure that your employees are getting the right support. ACAS guidance suggests that more flexible working arrangements are considered to allow your employees to work around their childcare responsibilities. So you might wish to agree sort of alternative working hours or patterns, perhaps reduce targets for an agreed period if they have targets. Any such agreement, though, you'd want to put in writing and just confirm that those changes are intended to be temporary only. If that's the case, obviously. You may want to adopt the same approach for any employees who are also providing care for sort of elderly relatives or anybody in their family that's unwell, as well as just those with children. And you might want to also bear in mind that your employees are sort of allowed time off to deal with an emergency situation involving a dependent. So that could be spouse, partner, children, parent, grandchild, for example. And that time off would be unpaid unless their contract specifies otherwise. And in this situation, staff are more likely to want to work flexibly if possible, rather than assert their right to time off under sort of statute. You may also experience issues with staff sickness at the minute. So according to the government figures, up to a fifth of the UK workforce may be sort of absent during the coronavirus epidemic at any one time. Now, those who are self-isolating because of contact with someone with coronavirus, or shielding because they're in a high-risk category, but don't feel unwell, could probably continue to work from home in the normal way. Obviously, if an employee has coronavirus symptoms, which mean they're too unwell to work from home, or they've tested positive and they're really unwell, you'd want to first check whether their contract entitles them to enhanced sick pay. So if you have a sort of enhanced sick pay policy, then you should follow that. If there's no such contractual right to enhanced sick pay, your employees and staff will be entitled to SSP, so statutory sick pay, at a rate of £95.85 per week for up to 28 weeks. Now, from the 13th of March onwards, the government changed the rules, so SSP can be claimed from the first day of incapacity, so sickness, whereas usually it's the fourth, unless they're off sick for any other reason, in which case SSP would be sort of payable from the fourth day, as usually would be the case prior to COVID. Now, in terms of sort of transitioning back to the office, you might have already started transitioning back to the office sort of after lockdown. You might have reverted back to home working and need to sort of retransition, depending on sort of what business activities you do and on the rules in the particular local authority area that you operate. So this has obviously been quite tricky for employers to navigate, especially because the rules are changing so often. You'll obviously need to refer to the guidelines tailored to your specific workplace setting and encourage your staff to follow the current advice. And you'll need to take steps to ensure that you keep your employees safe, okay? So you'll need to keep the workplace clean and sort of secure, provide things like hand sanitizer so that they can you can encourage keeping hands clean. You might want to stagger departure and arrival times so that staff don't sort of come into contact with each other as frequently. Encourage staff to avoid busy commuting times on public transport. And if possible, you might want to consider providing car parking facilities so that staff don't have to travel on public transport. Now, it's important to communicate with staff about what changes have been made to the workplace and address any concerns that they might have about returning to work and new ways of working. So you'd want to remind your employees of their duty to take reasonable care for their own health and safety, as well as that of their colleagues. So depending on your sort of circumstances, you may want to warn employees that if they fail to comply with the measures you've put in place, that would be treated as a disciplinary matter. Now, the question you might also ask is, can I require my employees to use the Test and Trace or Test and Protect app, or take a coronavirus test? So the Test and Protect app is voluntary, and therefore, while you can request employees use the app, it's not possible for you to force them to do so. The same would apply for coronavirus testing. So whilst you can request an employee to be tested, you can't force them to do so because, again, this is voluntary. But if an employee has symptoms or they've been in contact with someone that's tested positive, asking them to get a test would likely be considered a reasonable management instruction. So therefore, if any employee does refuse to get tested, you could consider initiating a disciplinary process on that basis. Okay. You should, however, listen to staff's concerns regarding the testing and see if there are any ways that you can resolve their concerns and their issues before you commence a disciplinary process. What should you do if an employee refuses to return to the office? So you may find that some employees are reluctant to return due to fears about coronavirus, and therefore the starting point would be to talk to them and try to address their concerns. So provided the current advice is that the employee could be expected reasonably to attend work, then it will be possible for you to consider investigating them for misconduct, and that would be based on their refusal to follow a reasonable management instruction and their resulting unauthorised absence. Okay. Now, in these circumstances, they would not be entitled to be paid if they don't sort of attend work. But before taking any disciplinary action, you would want to carefully consider whether there are any alternative ways that you could protect the employee's health and safety. For example, if they can continue to work from home, then that would be likely to resolve their concerns, but clearly it might not be possible for that to continue indefinitely. You'd also want to consider as well whether it would be discriminatory for you to refuse home working. For example, is the employee in a high-risk category? Do they have a disability? Are they pregnant, etc.? Because then there could be sort of discriminatory issues if you do refuse home working. So that leads me on to my next point, which is flexible working requests. So you're likely to receive quite a few flexible working requests when we do sort of transition back to the office. And the law relating to flexible working requests is not currently particularly employee friendly. It's sort of quite common now, flexible working, but the law hasn't quite caught up yet. You may have found that working from home has actually increased productivity of your staff. They may have a sense of improved job satisfaction and a healthier work-life balance, so they actually might be quite keen to continue working from home, if not all, then at least some of the time. They may also, other than just wanting to work at home, they may also want to work flexibly in other ways. So as an employer or a manager, you may want to be sort of aware, in fact, you will be more aware, I assume, after, the significant length of time that staff have potentially been working from home, which jobs can be done flexibly as a result of the pandemic. So your employees will have a statutory right to make a formal working request, sort of provided they've worked for you for 26 weeks or more. They must legally be considered an employee, so not sort of self-employed, for example. They may they can't have made a previous request in the last 12 months, so this has to be the first one within that 12-month period, and they're sort of also a parent, a carer, or returning from maternity leave. Now, if you have a workplace policy on flexible working, it's possible that those who don't have the legal right to make that request can do so, and others may wish to make an informal request. So as an employer, you will need to make a decision within 3 months, okay? You must treat all requests in the same way, so don't unlawfully discriminate against a particular employee. You'll need to have a meeting with the employee to discuss the request in further detail and allow them to be accompanied by a colleague to that meeting if they would like to be accompanied. You'd need to consider the request, for example, the benefits of those changes for the employee, but also the business versus any negative impact that it might have on the business. And for that reason, you might wish to consider a trial period. Now, if you reject the request, it must be for a sort of business reason. For example, you can't afford the cost of doing so, inability to reorganise work, etc. And it would be a good idea to put your decision in writing to avoid any confusion. You should allow your employer the opportunity to actually appeal your decision if you reject their request, and again be accompanied by a colleague to an appeal meeting if they would like to be accompanied. You'd also need to consider whether it would be discriminatory to refuse the request. More women than men seek flexible working arrangements, and therefore rejecting such a request may amount to indirect sex discrimination. If the employee, you need to consider, is the employee disabled? Could the refusal be considered a failure to make reasonable adjustments in those circumstances? Obviously, that would depend on the circumstances of the case and the circumstances of the individual employee, but that's something that you would need to consider sort of on a case-by-case basis. If you're not able to accept the request, you might want to consider modifying the request slightly to show flexibility and sort of willing to, try to agree to it in some form. So in conclusion, the coronavirus pandemic and the resulting lockdown is likely to cause an increase in requests for flexible working, and particularly once we've returned to office-based working entirely. And it's possible that home working arrangements may become the new normal. It remains to be seen, what changes will take place in terms of the law. And that concludes my talk. So thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Sasha. That was brilliant. So comprehensive, so much to consider.
Yeah, there is.
I think it's fair to say that there's, if you run like a PR agency or an organisation, then you will have a lot of stuff done already, like policies and things like that. But I think there are a number of things to consider here. So for the PR Fest audience, so we're like, I suppose they're like, everyone's like based in different places across the world. So from a legal perspective, they should probably check with their own law as well, because obviously we're talking about Scots law, English law, and what's happening in our country. Yeah, I think there's one point I thought was really interesting, and I've always been a fan of documenting things and making things
definitely
formal. So for things like you were saying, like changes in contracts, implementing new policies, and things like that, it's really important to put that in writing and get sign off essentially from the employee that they've read it, understood it, etc.
Exactly. Get their express agreement if you can. Definitely very important.
Yeah. And I think that's something that sometimes when we're caught up in our world of deadlines, and I mean, our deadlines are like, 5 minutes away, not 5 days away or 5 weeks away. It's, here and now sort of stuff. Sometimes things like that can be forgotten. I think it's important for senior leaders to remember that things need to be documented and formalized, and obviously seek guidance from a lawyer if there's anything to check over contractually and that type of stuff.
Yeah, that's always a good idea, just to get things reviewed if you're not sure.
Yeah, perfect. Some really interesting points there about equality and the Equality Act. Again, I think that people get caught up with working from home as in employee taken from one working space and put into another, but there are a lot of considerations. I know that things like some companies have bought staff like desks or chairs and things like that, but from an equality perspective, there's a lot more to consider.
Yeah. So obviously in the office, if a staff member may require reasonable adjustments, special equipment to help them do their job, then they will be able to speak with you about that in the office. But from home, that it's not always obvious. They may require additional equipment, and there's so many things to think about, like you say, even from a special chair, bigger screen, anything, because if they're working from perhaps their own laptop, they might need their actual just you know, they might not they might just want a bigger screen, just adapt equipment, because they might not be set up to work from home in the same way that they would be in an office. So it's just really
I think there was possibly a danger at the start, like people thought it'd be like a short-term working from home thing, so they won't have considered. And I think right now it's probably a good opportunity for everyone to review the working from home situation. It's probably a good idea to have another consultation with the team, and to start looking at these, I suppose, risk assessments, but also scenario planning around all the different things you talked about, particularly the potentially returning to work, the flexible working requests. I think that's going to be a big thing, and I don't think that enough people have considered what those requests might look like and how to handle that as well. Would you say that that it would be almost like obviously it's not disciplinary or grievance, but would it be similar sort of process you would go through for that type of consultation and discussion around that individual person requesting it?
How do you mean? So if someone makes a flexible working request, in terms of sort of meetings that you'd have with them, the process?
So I think there's two sides to me. So one, I think that a lot of people have embraced working from home and will actually be happy that employees want to do it more often. But equally, I know that from an agency perspective, and some of the bigger networked agencies, they're desperate to get the teams back in the office. And I don't think that is going to be happening for them. Like, realistically, people will be applying and saying, I want to work from home. I want to work more flexibly from that point of view. So if you're doing like a case-by-case basis, then it would be a similar thing.
That's literally it. You would need to consider the employee's particular circumstances again. Is there a reason that they are requesting to work flexibly? And, you know, if they are sort of a carer or they have children, then you would need to sort of give consideration to that. And that's not changed as a result of sort of coronavirus. If obviously your staff have genuine concerns about coming back into the office, the best thing to do is just to try and talk to them about those concerns. Why is it you don't want to return? You know, if you've got a staff member that isn't entitled to make a flexible request, and they simply refuse to come back into the office, or they just say, informally they make a request and say, I don't want to come back, I would like to work from home, then absolutely you'd be entitled to consider sort of disciplinary proceedings with regard to that, and that would be dealt with in the normal way that a disciplinary matter would be dealt with.
I think as well, been thinking from a business perspective, and this is kind of where you kind of have to think outside of our own world and our own field. You know, there will be people who have made business decisions not to have premises anymore, or to end a lease after whenever the next review is for their lease. So I think that's maybe when people are going to have a tricky situation, that their staff might have already been alerted to the fact that maybe there's a lease coming up for review, it's potentially going to end. But then if they downsize, say, to a smaller property, and because of this hybrid working that people are talking about, then that they're maybe more inclined to apply for the working from home, because they'll be like, well, what's the point then if we're downsizing anyway? I'm just trying to think of different scenarios that people might find themselves in, either from an employee or an employer perspective, because then it puts scenarios into play, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, it does. So
scenario planning, I would say, from all the stuff we've been talking about, is a huge part of what people need to be thinking about just now for the next 6 months, I would say.
That's concern. It's just because, you know, anything could happen. It's so uncertain at the minute. It is best to just try and consider, you know, all possibilities, and what would we do in certain scenarios.
Yeah. And do you think that should be the leadership team that does that, or do you think there needs to be involvement from, you know, particularly maybe taking into consideration consultations that have already taken place with team members, that they might have thrown up some scenarios they wouldn't have thought of before?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's quite important, really, just to kind of get everyone's views on things, and to see where everyone stands, because it might be, you know, you're all in the same boat, you all feel the same way, and that's the general consensus. So yeah, I think that's definitely a good idea. Yeah, it's communication.
And there's one really good point you made that I would never have said out loud, but I would probably have thought it myself. And that was, what if my employer didn't think I was doing a good job working from home or being productive? Normally it would be the other point of view, where it'd be the employer thinking you're not being as productive because you're not doing as much, but the employee thinking that is a different thing. So I think that's to do with them, you know, supporting them, communicating with them, part of a bigger sort of employee engagement strategy, which again I think would be a really good time to review at that sort of strategy as well.
Yeah, definitely. So whilst the employer might not actually be thinking that about their staff, you know, you might know this member of staff is great, they're not going to push their luck just because they're at home. That member of staff might be thinking, if they're not sort of regularly told, you know, yep, you know, you're meeting our expectations, or these are our expectations of you while you're working from home. We know it will be more difficult, but this is what we expect. And they can at least meet those objectives. If you don't have that, you can find that staff will start to think, you know, gosh, they actually might think I'm not doing anything, or am I doing enough? I don't know. So again, just speaking with them, about sort of what the expectations are, how they're doing, reassuring them, you know, look, this is going as well as it can do, well done, kind of thing. That can help.
And I think if you'd mentioned a sort of monitoring system in place, I think linking back into that and that regular feedback will give reassurance to both parties, and have a two-way dialogue rather than just being one-sided.
Yeah, so it wouldn't need to be sort of a formal appraisal. It can just be, you know, regular contact that you agree will take place at certain stages, as this kind of the whole thing progresses, and yeah, just sort of, it can even just be an informal chat, as opposed to a formal appraisal kind of thing.
And the final point I had was around stuff actually I talk about quite a lot, which is again kind of coming back to our own reputation. And one of the things that is actually, in fact, I spoke at Bellwether Green Conference last year about it, and that was risk and reputation, but specifically towards data, IT, cybersecurity. And they're really good points, because the quick rush to move everyone home, to get them equipment, to make sure they can access the servers, etc., again, is possibly a really good time to be reviewing those things. When was the last time passwords were changed? How often? As you say, who else gets access to that computer? What have if they've been plugging USBs into it? Like, things like that.
Yeah, so having a clear policy on that is very important, just to prevent that from happening, because obviously the GDPR rules are, you know, fairly strict, and obviously you will have your own sort of confidentiality rules as a business, that you would want employees to continue to comply with even from home. And obviously it is more difficult to enforce and police, but having those rules there is just useful, because, you know, that's what your employees should be complying with.
And even, you know, just thinking about how much data I have access to as not necessarily the controller or maybe the processor, but, you know, we all have definitely got a hand in our clients' data and what we're working with them, because it's important that we have that for strategy and measurement and evaluation and stuff. So that kind of gets even deeper into not just our own, but from our clients' perspective as well.
Exactly. And we're the same, you know, sort of solicitors, you know, we deal with clients, so it's exactly the same. You have to have those protections in place. Yeah, measures.
So, I mean, there's a very comprehensive overview. Thank you so much for your time.
Very welcome.
If anyone has any questions for you, where can they find you?
So I will sort of send you my email address, just so you can kind of link that to this talk.
Right.
If they just
bellwethergreen.com.
Yes. Okay.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.